Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. Joining the panel once again, to my right, which is your left, is Lawrence Haber, fan of 23 years and a music composer. We were just talking about UFC. The promoter of UFC, Dana White, along with matchmaker Joel Silva, and the Fertitta brothers have really sprung ahead in terms of the pay-per-view market and probably taken a lot of people our age away from crappy pro wrestling and turned us into MMA fans. But to talk about the best and worst promoters, we really need to start at the beginning, because promoters are what got wrestling started in the first place. And really, all of us owe a debt to the Goldust Trio. And I don't mean Dusty, Dustin, and Cody. I'm talking about Toots Mondt, Edge Stringer Lewis, and Billy Sando. These are the guys that took wrestling from the carnival acts of the turn of the century and turned it into this unique art form that we now see in America. They started fixing the matches, and even though it started off as this this work, it's eventually evolved into something that, when it's at its best, could be such a great, unique American art form that is spread throughout the world. But fast forwarding a little bit to 1948, when the NWA formed, the first president was Sam Muchnick. Everyone in the different territories around the country has their own champion, and the idea was to have one recognized world champion tour all the territories, and it would be special for everybody to share. Of course, a lot of people say it was a monopoly. They were investigated by the federal government a little bit and got away with it, like wrestling promoters usually do with crimes they do. But a lot of people weren't allowed into their club. That was the thing about the NWA. They were into themselves, and any other wrestler who didn't agree with them, any other promoter who tried starting up, they got...
Where have I heard that before? Or now?
History repeats itself for those who forget it. But we do want to pay tribute to history, because it's amazing to think how everyone looks fondly back on the territorial system, and that was decades ago at this point. Could you imagine how much it could work now with the internet? How much more aware we could be of other promotions in other parts of the country or even the world? But we're not going to talk necessarily about these foreign promoters such as Antonio Pena in Mexico, Giant and Mrs. Baba in Japan, and Masawa, who just died. We're going to talk about some of the more familiar American ones who are obviously the most successful ones in the world. And the most successful promoter is Vince McMahon. These promoters, and booker and promoter, are two different things that sometimes cross over. The promoter starts handling who's going to win and lose and the angles and whatnot. So it does kind of get, more often than not, meshed in between each other, even though they're two separate jobs in and of themselves. Vince McMahon is often said to be a genius, and that's a word that's thrown around a lot. But being that, every person who's written underneath him, from Pat Patterson to Brian Gewirtz and everyone in between, Jerry Jarrett, since he has the final say on everything, and there's been a lot of good and a lot of bad, doesn't that kind of take away from the genius label if there's so much bad to go along with so much good?
I don't think so. He gets the final say on who gets to be under him. And he knew all those years that Patterson was the great match writer and matchmaker. He saw what was changing with ECW in the 90s and how he needed to freshen up the approach, and chose to put Vince Russo in charge and let him in his ear. You can brand him a genius despite the fact that he has positioned so many people under him. And if you want to say he's not a genius, you have to say at least he's a great manager.
He's a great marketer.
Great businessman, period.
But he has an eye for talent.
He has that ruthless mentality as he took over all the other promotions, which is what his father promised not to do. He went and did it, and look where everyone else is now. I mean, he's the guy that really brought wrestling into mainstream marketability.
Out of the smoking gyms.
If wrestling didn't get popular because of TV on the Dumont network in the 50s.
If we go with history, even right
Not
before,
on that level.
if we go right before 1984, interesting year for that, and Hulk Hogan, and you look at the early 80s, there was a ton of WWF-style wrestling in North America. Yeah. In Dallas, Texas, Fritz von Erich had music videos, multi-camera shoots, a lot of the elements that became associated with things that Vince McMahon invented. Now, that's not to say that Vince McMahon didn't have a better eye for things like MTV
and Connections
and New York, Madison Square Garden, to bring it to a national level, as he did with ECW-style wrestling and other various elements of what we consider to be WWF innovations. The credit does not go to a lot of other promoters who helped invent what we consider to be the WWF out of the smoky gymnasium into the garden style.
Especially because we now have access to 24/7 where it's
Absolutely.
okay, because he owns wrestling history, to exploit it in this way. When we go back and look at Don Owens Portland and Roddy Piper is doing the same coked up character that he always has. Vern Gagne had Hulk Hogan doing the same t-shirt tearing and handcuffing thing,
Absolutely.
pretty much Hulk Hogan. When you look at these different examples, Crockett and the amount of stars that were already there, Big John Studd in Mid-Atlantic, do you think in a way they should get some credit? Because McMahon, it seems, looking back on this stuff, took guys that were already stars, like Junkyard Dog for Bill Watts, and put them on a national scale.
Of course they should get some credit, but it's McMahon. He wants to take credit of everything. It's WWE 24/7, not wrestling 24/7.
But if he's going to get credit for everything, I think it covers both the positive and the negative. Because if he is such a smart businessman, and you would look at the numbers and would probably think so, maybe not the past few years, but no one else has become a billionaire in the past because of promoting. However, isn't he letting other shit get in the way? Is he listening to the wrong people and letting his ego get above a paycheck? Because otherwise, why would he have done the invasion the way he did?
He's become so protective of that title of the owner of everything that he shoots himself in the foot all the time with it. And he tries to get into other businesses that he just doesn't belong in. It's the ultimate tragedy. He can't admit that he is the wrestling promoter of wrestling promoters.
I think
he wants to prove that.
It's been very evident.
Bischoff.
that
It's a daddy.
gotten
It's
away with the products.
it's a Freudian thing ultimately, because the ultimate act that made the WWF what it is today was him defying his father.
Well,
that was the thing that changed everything.
Well,
Yes.
his father, much like Sam Mushnick in St. Louis, was one of the few wrestling promoters that you ever hear about being respected. The wrestlers respected him, the fans respected him, and McMahon went in the opposite direction, fuck your rules, and changed wrestling forever. That's pretty much a good thing. But doesn't it say a lot about other promoters in the world that they can't get on the same page and take McMahon down when they've got so many resources?
Well, that was always the thing with all the superclass shows in the 80s. They tried to get the NWA and AWA folks together, and the whole time they were in the back room trying to steal each other's wrestlers.
In the back of everyone's mind, they think that every wrestler's dream wants to work for the WWF. That's where the money is, that's where the exposure is. So even if some of these promoters gather up and try to start their new promotion, I think Vince McMahon could take their top star just like that.
That wasn't always like that. Everybody wanted to wrestle at the Garden, which so happened to be the New York territory run by Vince McMahon Sr. And it was after the 80s when Vince McMahon Jr. completely monopolized everything that it became every wrestler's dream. It was every wrestler's dream to be the NWA champion, which the WWF was part of, part and parcel of. It was not to be on Raw. That's a completely different, and it's a generational thing too.
He's never been the same, though, ever since Eric Bischoff came around. The reason he's so protective of everything, he finally got taken down a peg, and what he had done to everybody, what he had done to everybody else, he was now looking into the face of, oh my God, we're going out of business next.
Well, we are going to move on and talk about Eric Bischoff, but before we do, I do want to say one thing about Vince McMahon. As much as we vilify him on this show and as much as I may despise what he's done, I feel about Vince McMahon as I do about George Lucas. He needs to stay as far away from his own creation as possible at this point. When he was on his game, which he hasn't been on in probably over a decade, he has produced some really good TV every once in a while, and even if it is a collection of this from Stu Hart, this from Bill Watts, this from Crockett, this from whoever, not that he's even aware of that shit, other writers steal it for him, he has put it together in a good package, and we wouldn't be talking about wrestling probably right now. Maybe we would, but we wouldn't be so indoctrinated to WWE mentality. Right. Either way, we're going to move on and talk about some of the other promoters when we come back.
He did a good job too with the marketing with us as kids, getting us into the toys so that
the action figures, the dolls,
the action figures, right? Getting us early at an early age as kids, and then so we follow this product all our lives. So now we're older,
kids are
and we have to watch it, whether or at least pay attention to it, whether we like it or not, because it's such a big part of our childhood.
I think that's tied into what Eric always says about is it that maybe it's not that the WWF and Vince McMahon is wrestling. Maybe it's that we grew up with it. We're the generation that believes that.
Right. Yeah.
Our parents that watch wrestling or whatever, they don't believe that. They watch
See,
WWF and they
we
talk
were born
about
around WrestleMania.
if you grew up in Georgia in Georgia, man. In the
Anderson.
70s, you don't freaking associate. You may know who Bruno Sammartino is and Billy Graham, but to you think about people in Florida, in Georgia. If you grew up in Texas, the Von Erichs were the golden gods. You know, if you grew up in Amarillo, or if you grew up near Mexico, you think of Lucha. I mean, Vince McMahon.
You don't think of Shawn Michaels?
You do. You think of Shawn Michaels, sure. You think of Jose Lothario and Savio Vega. Well, if you're in Japan, you think of Quang.
The way I picture McMahon is like Vern Gagne gives Hogan the platform to become a star, fucks it up, McMahon goes, put some yellow on him and put him on a lunchbox.
Yeah.
He's gonna puke. He's gonna puke. Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. We were talking about the best and worst promoters, and moving on, at the end we mentioned Eric Bischoff, my hero, who is the only promoter to ever usurp Vince McMahon from his seat, temporarily of course. We talk about McMahon taking people from different territories. The height of Nitro was like a great variety show for wrestling tastes, because you had the old school WWF guys, you even had a touch of AWA, guys from the UK, Mexico, and Japan, and all these hot young up-and-coming Americans.
The reason Bischoff was the guy to do it was because he is Vince McMahon. One of the things about Vince McMahon is he knows everything about wrestling, but yet knows nothing about wrestling at the same time. Eric Bischoff will always say he's not a wrestling guy. He knew
I don't get that,
enough.
though. He started in AWA.
Yeah, but he wasn't a wrestler. He didn't grow up.
He wasn't a fan.
He wasn't the son. He wasn't like
TV
Mike
guy.
Graham or Greg Gagne or even Vince. He was a complete guy who got into it because he wanted to be on TV. He wanted to be a Ken doll. And eventually, he got enough knowledge of wrestling with his ruthless nature, marketing, and Ted Turner's wallet to make a run and beat Vince McMahon.
He was an opportunist, and I think that's a key point. He had money when Vince McMahon didn't. At that time, 94 to 98, those are kind of the dark years of WWF. Vince McMahon just came out of the steroid trial, and these guys, I guess, weren't making so much money as maybe the guys in the 80s. And here comes Ted Turner and Bischoff has like this unlimited bank, and he's able to steal these guys. Hey, you're making this? Come over here. We'll pay you this amount of money.
Not only was he stealing
Boom.
names, he stole the NWO storyline from Japan. He's already said that. He basically just saw what was going on. It is the same cartoon that you guys have been watching for years. But now come on over here, look what we got. Look at this cool stuff going on our show.
That's exactly what McMahon did. I'm going to take all the stars from the other territories, the stars from ECW instead of the AWA, the stars from Mexico, and eventually said, now I'm going to bring your stars in. I mean, he says he positioned people over time. He had Hogan and Okerlund and Ventura. And after a while, he ended up with a perfect storm. Vince was down on his luck to go and make a run, and they went head to head.
See, he's doing what TNA's scared to do. TNA wants to say, "Oh, we're coming up there," but they're using WWF stars and doing their own stupid shit with them.
They're in a time slot where they're not opposed with any other wrestling on a night with a 1-hour Superstars program that half the country doesn't get. And they still can't
know about.
They still can't get past ECW's rating.
Well, we haven't gotten to ECW yet, but one more thing on Bischoff. Was part of his success with these new spins on old characters or new faces, was part of that letting the talent do their own stuff? Because this whole Hollywood writer setup that WWE has had for the past almost 9 years with Stephanie McMahon and the losers from Hollywood,
right?
It's holding down a lot of people. Yeah. It's restricting them.
There's nothing raw about Raw. Everything's scripted, everything's contrived. What's good about Nitro is that you got these characters who can actually say what they want. They're building up matches, and there's such a natural feel to the show that you don't see nowadays.
Well, a lot of people were saying that the best stuff in the past year was Jericho's stuff with Michaels and Michaels' stuff with Undertaker. So if Michaels gets to do most of his own stuff and it ends up being good, maybe they should start listening to what Bischoff was letting people like Jericho.
Well, they let certain guys.
When wrestling was at its hottest, you had Austin, Rock, Foley. These are three guys that could really go out there and talk without a script.
And those are all guys who, Austin Rock, who accidentally got over because some of their personalities started showing.
Well, they invented themselves. That's the thing. Hulk Hogan
they were over when they
himself.
weren't meant to be.
But does it usually end up in disaster when you give wrestlers who are active the book? We all know about Dusty Rhodes and Kevin Nash and even Kevin Sullivan fucking shit up. Should they ever give wrestlers creative control, even with Hogan and Bret Hart?
No. It sounds like a good idea on paper, but it never ends up being that way.
You don't need creative control. It's a job just like any other job. When they give them creative control, look what happens.
I mean, I wish I could make up my own hours and pay and do whatever I want.
I wish, hey, you make up your own job. Come on in.
Once a week.
Here's a big paycheck.
I don't necessarily agree with you there, because the saying I hate is absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I absolutely do not agree. I think absolute power exposes what's really deep down in your own heart and mind. I think if that's not really part of what makes you you, power isn't going to corrupt you. But power is also something that Paul Heyman had over his fan base and wrestlers, and was able to turn this bingo hall promotion into practically a national phenomenon. Did he try to take ECW too far?
He definitely tried to take it too far, but the strengths that he had was he was able to take anybody and see something in them worth putting out there, use what you got, and make it work. Find what the person is good at, play to their strengths, create a character, create a storyline, create a comedy thing, and put them out there, allow them to develop, and test it. See if the fans like it. There was a lot of stuff in ECW that appeared once or twice and then never again. He was really good at knowing when it was time to cut it. The problem was, from a business perspective, as many independent wrestling promotions do, he got excited that people were taking an interest and decided, oh, I can do this nationally. Because I never thought I could make the Eastern Championship Wrestling into ECW. I never thought I could run shows every weekend. I never thought I could do this or that and bring in talent. I never thought I could be on pay-per-view. And unfortunately, he was right.
But was ECW by its very nature too niche to be competitive with the big two?
I think absolutely it was. There was
Especially at
no
the time.
way that a guy like Sandman is going to be able to compete against a guy like Austin. They seem similar, but
In terms of
in
ability.
terms of
I don't
ability,
agree.
they are in two
In the
different
grand scheme
worlds.
of things, it was two different markets. ECW built a foundation being shown at 2 o'clock in the morning. They could get away with certain stuff that they couldn't if they were shown at 9 o'clock, repeating on Raw. I mean, if you were watching Raw and then you go to ECW, it's going to look like a high school gym house show. Yes, we are a small show. We are the Howard Stern of wrestling, and we are damn proud of it.
You can't be the Revolution if you're on national television. The Revolution's not supposed to be
Underground.
televised.
Yeah,
but I
there's
have to disagree with
underground
Chris's point that like the Sandman or whoever couldn't be on Raw and be a big star as Austin. If you let him do that gimmick with the music, with the beers, and not have him get stunned, play to his strengths, that was what made Paul Heyman great. And when he wrote for the WWF, he proved that because he was able to figure out what works for certain characters, what
He
doesn't.
hit all their
And
negatives.
you do get some bad apples and lay some eggs sometime, and not everybody is meant to be a wrestler and everybody's meant to be a star. But if you take Johnny Grunge and the Cheetah Kid and you put them together with hockey jerseys on, you have them wave their arms like this and give the people a song to sing along to, and then they throw people through tables, well, you got enough stuff there you threw against the wall to have some stars, and all of a sudden everybody's got Public Enemy t-shirts on.
Doesn't a lot of ECW not hold up, though?
A lot of anything doesn't hold up if you watch it back.
Not quite. Good stuff is good forever, and ECW wasn't quite on that level.
It's pretty.
It started
Not the
getting
whole-
too
not-
big for
It
itself.
screams Bill Clinton's carefree 90s when you watch it today.
Yeah, but I mean, so
I
did
mean,
the
they
Attitude
just didn't
Era.
have the business mind of someone like
Yeah.
Bischoff and Eric, and I think that's what.
Thank you,
the main problem
Rodney.
was.
Well, someone who was a fan of Heyman's work was Vince Russo, who took a lot of that style and applied it to Attitude. Now, Vince Russo doesn't really get enough credit from anybody but himself for applying those ideas to WWE. Everyone says, filter Vince McMahon, blah, 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 as if McMahon could have come up with that. Maybe he would have, but it was Russo who initiated it. So, for as much credit as Russo gets for killing WCW, which Kevin Sullivan doesn't get enough of, shouldn't Russo get as much credit for creating Attitude, or for leaving us in the shit that it's left us afterwards?
Of course he should. This guy really took what was in the Dark Ages and brought it to a whole new level that no one would have foreseen. Russo's booking was good up until 99. Before that, they were coming up with a lot of great shit, and he was part of the reason why they started beating Nitro.
So, how come he can't help them, by them I mean Dixie Carter, Jeff Jarrett, and etc., help TNA become the void filler for WCW like it should have been
I think
years
Because
ago?
time has passed him by.
just like in music, I think he's a one-hit wonder.
Everyone's still trying to recreate this Attitude Era,
That's
and
one
no one's
problem
gonna
that
get
they need
over
to get
it.
past. If
No one could get over
ECW was hot in the 90s and everybody stole from that and made wrestling hot in general, you got to find what else is hot now. UFC or something.
Yeah, what
Right,
made the
you have-
90s the 90s that it wasn't the 80s or the 70s.
yeah, and the millennium's not the 90s.
70s, 80s,
Yeah.
90s, you look at them, they all look different on your television. This right now doesn't strike me.
It looks like
as,
the 90s.
It looks just, exactly the same.
Much like how Heyman was inspired by Nick Goulas and Jerry Jarrett in Memphis and Onita in FMW and takes some of their ideas and spin it around, TNA just seems as if they've got some ideas, but then they fuck it up somehow. The thing about promoting wrestling is any downtime or going out of business really has to do with bad booking, firstly, more than anything. We're talking about creative stuff. And anytime any one of these promotions, World Class, Crockett, ECW, Nitro, Raw, whatever it is, the times that they are successful is when they're doing something new or have a new spin on something, something unique, something different than what anybody else is doing. TNA has the groundwork for that. They've got Ultimate X, they've got the six-sided ring, they've visually
They're on the same channel as
also
UFC.
had that-
It's right there. It's on their door. They've got UFC, the hottest new sport, and they are
I don't
not,
think that has anything to do with it.
That's
No,
the
I
next
don't
thing.
think-
Everyone on the show has said it. UFC.
I don't think
it
shouldn't affect their product. If
Yes,
anything,
it
it should
should.
help them. It should help them.
That's what I'm saying.
I don't think
They
it
should
should
use
be a
that.
negative.
That's what wrestling needs. It needs to take some of these elements, whether it's stylistic elements, whether it's the element of realism. Maybe it's treating it like a sport again, for
Right.
one, because half of the UFC thing is that it's a sport about combat. Best people like that about pro wrestling.
It should just be about good guy versus bad guy. But somehow in TNA, nobody knows who the good guys and the bad guys are.
They want everything to be a joke, everything an inside joke, everything's a shoot. It's not a shoot, it's real, it's celebrities. It's not for them.
They might call it sports entertainment. It will never be taken seriously in the world of entertainment. You need to go back to sports.
They're not getting Emmys. You could call them superstars.
Call
whatever.
them wrestlers. Stop calling it the WWE Universe and the TNA Nation. Call us fans. That's all you need.
Well, TNA probably screwed themselves over from the beginning by calling themselves TNA in the first place. Another stupid Russoism. But that's the end of our discussion on Best and Worst Promoters. Coming up next month, we're going to be talking about the fallout of UFC 100, Lesnar versus Mir, and the best and worst big men in wrestling. Then we're also going to be talking about Puroresu, Japanese pro wrestling, especially in light of Misawa dying in the ring, unfortunately, a couple weeks ago. Hey, at least they had the class to stop the show. WWE should learn about that. We're also going to be talking about some of the best and worst hardcore wrestlers. So for the panel, Martin LeConte, Brett Simonello, Chris Harris, Rodney LeConte, Lawrence Haber, I'm your host, Eric Santamaria. Thank you and join us next week.